Let us commence. We are on DAF Yud Aleph and Mid Aleph. We're at the two dots. Mikramuat v'halachos merubos. Just to remind you, the Mishnah had told us that there are three sets of law, Shabbos, Chagiga, and Me'ilah, where the Torah has scant verbiage, but there is a lot of detail in the halacha contained in Torah Sheba'al Peh. And we now have a brisa which tells us that there are other types of law that are of the same genre. Tana, negoim v'ohalos mikramuot v'halachos merubos. The brisa says that when it comes to the laws of tzoras, and when it comes to the laws of tumas ohel, which how a person becomes tameh, when in an overhang with tumah, there you have sparse text in the Torah, but you have a lot of detail in Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the Gemara asks, how can you say that about tzoras? Negoim mikra muat, negoim mikra merubahu. There's plenty of text in the Torah. Let's look at Parshas Tazriim and Parshas Mitzorah, and you'll see a huge amount of verbiage in the Torah devoted to the laws of tzoras. So Amar Rav Papa Hachika Amar. What the brisa really means to say is as follows: Negoim mikra meruba v'halachos mu'atos, ohalos mikra muot v'halachos merubos. Really you have to read the brisa as follows. When it comes to the laws of tzoras, there's a lot of verbiage and a minimal amount of additional halachic information that is contained in Torah Sheba'al Peh. But the converse is true with ohalos. There is sparse verbiage, which is the beginning of Parshas Chukas, and a much larger amount of information, of halachic information that's contained in Torah Sheba'al Peh. So, umay nafkamina, so of what import is this? What's the relevance of contrasting the laws of Negoim and the laws of Ohalos? Imistafkalach milsa b'Negoim ayin b'kroi, v'imistafkalach milsa b'Ohalos ayin b'masnisin. The answer is that if you're not sure about a certain detail of law having to do with tzoras, your best resource to find the answer is in the Chumash itself. But if you have a question about the laws of Tumas Ohel, and you're not sure how to resolve a specific case, your best resource is to look in the Mishnah. Now for us this is a non sequitur from a halachic standpoint, because we don't have laws of tzoras or laws of Tumas Ohel, at least for most people. Perhaps for Kohanim the law, there would be more information. But the point is that this is where you would need to look if you wanted to know the halacha from a practical standpoint. Now we go on to the next part of the Mishnah, which had told us that there are certain types of halacha where there is textual support in the pasuk, and like the Mishnah had said, the categories are dinim, avodos, taharos, utumeos, arayos. It talked about tort law. It talked about sacrificial law. It talked about the laws of what's tohor and what's tameh, and it talked about forbidden relationships. So the Mishnah had said the verbiage as follows: Yesh lehen al mashi yismochu. There is text on which to rely. In other words, you can find supporting text in the Chumash to tell you the halacha, and then it said vehein hein gufei Torah, and they are the corpus or the body, the main essence of the Torah. So the Gemara's question now is based on the following: Dinan michtav kesivan. Why does the Mishnah only say that there is some text on which to rely, on which the halacha may rely? That seems to be you're not giving enough credit to the actual verbiage that is contained in the Torah. There is some verbiage in the Torah that you can rely on, but there's much more that's not written. It's what it sounds like. So the Gemara says, but it's pretty explicit in the Chumash, all the Torah law. Look at Parshas Mishpatim, look at Parshas Kiseitze, Parshas Shoftim, and so forth. So the Gemara says, Lo nitzracha ela l'cheder Rebbe. Yes, but there are certain things like Rebbe's halacha which are non-explicit. You have to rely on Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Tanya Rebbe Omer, nefesh tachas nafesh, mamon. So the Torah, in talking about the following scenario, the Torah talks about a situation where two men are fighting. A woman, the wife of one of the men, comes in to try and stop the fight, and she's pregnant. So the Torah says that if one of the guys strikes the woman accidentally while he's trying to punch the guy, and he ends up punching the woman, and he causes her to miscarry, so then he has to pay for the cost of the miscarried fetus. There's a financial restitution. And then the following pasuk says, V'im ason yiyeh, and if there's an even greater mishap, which actually ends up causing the death of the woman herself, then you shall give a soul for a soul. So what do those words soul for a soul mean? So Rabbi says it doesn't mean that you put him to death. This was not an intentional murder, but that rather it means he needs to make financial restitution not only for the fetus but also for the woman also. So ata omer mamon o eno ela nefesh mamish. Or no, perhaps you'll argue that he should be put to death for this. So therefore, nemra nesina lamata v'nemra nesina lamayla, malahalan mamon afkan mamon. So you have to look at the verb in each of the psukim. In the previous pasuk, which had talked about making financial restitution for the miscarriage, it uses the verb v'nosan, right? He shall give. And over here in this pasuk, which talks about giving a soul for a soul, he uses the exact same verb of v'nosata nefesh tachas nefesh. So therefore, just like in the previous pasuk, v'nosan implies financial payment, so too over here, the implication is financial payment. We go on. So in other words, there are plenty of laws having to do with making financial restitution to an injured party, and other tort laws that are not explicit in the Torah, and therefore this is one example. I don't know why the Gemara chose this example. It could have used the ayin tachas ayin. So I'm not sure why the Gemara dafka chose this example.
I've got a question. Why would this not need to go to an miklat?
What? So that's a good question. Someone else asked that question in Shir this morning. I surmise that the answer is that here this was an act of violence. You only go to an ir miklat if you're mamish shogig, but you're not involved in a violent act, and someone dies as a result. But here he's involved in committing an act of violence. He doesn't mean to kill the woman. He means to give a zetz to the other guy. You don't go to an ir miklat for that. You'll have to wait on you'll have to hold off on the rest. But there is a tosfos over here. There is a tosfos over here which talks about nefesh ayin tachas ayin, but I haven't had a chance to look at it, so you'll have to do some more research. Okay, avodos. So the Gemara now says, what about the next category where it says that there is textual support, but there's more than just textual support for karbanos. There's a whole comprehensive layout of law in the Torah. So the Gemara says, Michtav ksivan, lo nitzrach ela lo holachas dam. So the answer is that we're talking of, there are certain aspects of the karbanos which are not explicit. Here's an example. Holachas dam, we know that there are 4 steps of the avoda. Standard 4 steps are shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Remember for our days in Kodshin, there's the shchita, the slaughter, the receiving of the blood from the neck into a receptacle, the transportation of the blood from where you're standing at the time of shchita to the mizbeach, and then the 4th step is the sprinkling of the blood on the mizbeach. Now the only step out of those 3 which is not absolutely necessary is holacha, is the transportation. Why? Because in theory, if you brought the animal to the edge of the mizbeach, you could slaughter it there and then do the kabbalah and the zrika without doing holacha. And therefore one might have thought that holacha is not as serious of a stage, such that if a person normally has an improper thought, a pigul thought, he can invalidate the korban through in doing one of the stages of the avoda while having that improper thought. You might have thought that since holacha is not a necessary process, then if you have a thought of pigul, maybe it doesn't invalidate the korban while you're doing the holacha, the transportation. So the chiddush is, and this is something that's from Torah Sheba'al Peh, is that you're even liable, even if during the holacha you have a pigul machshava. Detanya, v'hikrivu zu kabbalas hadam. So there's a pasuk that talks about slaughtering the animal and then being makrivit, and then bringing it close. And the step that's immediately after shchita is not bringing it close. the pasuk here has to be interpreted that when it says v'hikrivu, it doesn't mean bringing the blood or the animal close. It rather must be referring to the act of Kabbalah. So what's strange or what's unusual is that the act of Kabbalah, of receiving the blood, is described in terms of bringing it close. Va'afgara rachmana b'lashon holacha. So the Torah uses the language of holacha for an act of Kabbalah. Now, how do you know that the word v'hikrivu means holacha, means transportation? Dichsiv v'hikriv ha'kohen asakol v'hiktir ha'mizbecha. Because we have another pasuk that says the kohen shall bring close everything and then place it on the mizbeach. V'amar marzu holacha sevarim lekevish. And this pasuk means when it says v'hikriv, it doesn't mean to place it on the mizbeach. It means to transport the animal parts to the ramp. And therefore, lememra deholacha losifka michalal Kabbalah. So therefore, ergo, the fact that the Torah talks about Kabbalah in terms of holacha, using a verb that implies holacha, tells me that there's an equation between the laws of Kabbalah to the laws of holacha, such that just like when you're doing Kabbalah, the receiving of the blood, if you have a machshava of pigul, you invalidate the korban. So too, when you're doing the holacha, the transportation, if you have a machshav of pigul, you invalidate the korban. Next, taharos. So the laws of that which is tahar. So mechtav ksivan there too. Why do you have to tell me that there's only textual support? It's actually quite explicit. Lo nitzracha ela l'shir mikvah de lo ksiva. So here's an example of something that is non-explicit with the laws of tahara, of purification. How large a mikvah must be. The Torah never tells you that it has to be 40 sahs of water. Titanya virachatz b'mayim es kol b'saro. That a person, in order to purify himself, has to bathe in his whole body in water. B'mei mikvah. So first of all, it says b'mayim with a patach, which means in the water. So that implies it has to be a special kind of water, meaning it has to be rainwater. And es kol bisaro, and his entire flesh, mayim shekol gufo ola bahen. It has to be sufficient water such that you can immerse your entire body into it. The average human body, male body in this case, has to be immersible in that water. The kama hein, and how much is that? Ama al ama barum shalosh amos. 1 by 1 by 3 cubic amas. V'shiru chachamim me mikvah arboim sa. And the rabbis measured that amount, and they said that equals 40 sahs of water. So that's an example of something that's non-explicit, and that's why the Mishnah says that there's textual support, but not a full laying out of all of the law. Tameos, and similarly that which is tamei, also michtav ksivan. The Gemara asks the same question. What do you mean? It's quite explicit. No, lo nitzracha elo lecha adashim in hasheretz de lo ksiva. Here's an example of a law that's non-explicit, and you need Torah Shabal Peh. What is the law? It tells you that we have 8 species of low crawling animals that upon their death, if you touch them, you become tamei with tumah sheretz. And the law is, the Torah Shabal Peh law tells us that you don't need the fully intact carcass of that creature. All you need is the size of a lentil from that creature in order to transmit tumah to you. And how do I know this? The Tanya Bohem. The Torah says that if you touch them, you become tummy, referring to the sheretz. Yachol bekulan, you might think that the only way to become tummy is if you touch the entire creature. Tamulomar mehem. But there's another word in the pasuk that says mehem, from them, which implies only a portion of them. Yachol b'mikzasin, but then don't think that if you only touch a portion of them, that will render you tummy, because tamalomer bohem, because bohem implies the opposite. You have to touch the whole creature. So how do you reconcile bohem and mehem? Chagiga b'mikzaso shuhu kekula, that you have to touch a portion of a sheretz that is tantamount to an entire sheretz, which means that as long as I touch a portion of a sheretz's body that in theory could be the size of an entire sheretz, then I will become tamei. And shiru chachamim b'cha'adasha shekain chomet tchilas b'cha'adasha. So the rabbis estimated that the smallest that a sheretz could ever be is the size of a lentil, because a certain kind of sheretz called a chomet, which they told me they translate as a snail in some of the texts, is the smallest snail is the size of a lentil bean, right? And so therefore, So therefore, that would be the smallest. If you had a piece of a weasel, let's say, that was the size of a lentil, that would also render tamei. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer kiznav halita'a, he doesn't disagree with the shear of a lentil, but he says it's not based on the snail, but it's based on the tail of a certain kind of lizard. Because if you cut off a lizard's tail, it still is animated for a significant amount of time, and that shows you that there's still life in a portion of a sheretz the size of a lentil, and that's how you know that by touching it you become tummy. Let's go on. Arayos, we have the same question. By sexual crimes, there too the Torah is quite explicit. Gemara says no. Lo nitzracha levito me'anusaso de lo ksiva. There is a certain type of law by Arayos that is not explicit, and that is if a man has relations with his daughter from a woman that he's not married to. Man has an extramarital relationship and he has a daughter thereby. Having a relationship with that daughter is one of the arayos for which you get put to death. And how do I know that? That's non-explicit in the Torah. Now what's ironic is the Torah only talks about your granddaughter from such a relationship, from an extramarital relationship. There the Torah does say that this is one of the arayos, but it never says explicitly that a daughter from that relationship. So you would say, well, it's a kal v'chomer, right? Mm-hmm. If your granddaughter is forbidden, then surely your daughter is forbidden. But the Gemara, but we have a principle of ein onshin min hadin. You cannot apply the rules of logic to put someone to death. So you have to have either something explicit or something that's derived from a hermeneutic principle like a gezerah shava. And so therefore the Gemara says, the Amar Rava, Amar li Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Asya heina heina, Asya zima zima. I will spare you all of the hermeneutic acrobatics here, but we have three psukim that we link together from the words heina, that links two psukim together, and zima, which connects two other psukim together. One pasuk talks about the prohibition of having relations with a woman that you're married to and her daughter. And it makes no difference whether that daughter is your daughter or the daughter from a previous husband. As long as you're married to that woman, then her daughter is prohibited to you. We also learn that based on another connection, another Gzeira Shava, that if you do have relations with that girl, you get the death penalty by burning based on the connection to having relations with your mother-in-law. So if that's the case, once we make all of those three connections, we can connect, those two connections, we then connect daughter to a granddaughter, and we learn that not only is it forbidden to have a relationship with your granddaughter from an extramarital affair, but even your daughter as well. So we connect granddaughter to daughter of your wife, and we connect daughter of your wife to mother-in-law. Once we've connected all those, we learn that all three cases get death by burning, and that's how we know, even though this is not explicitly written, that the daughter from an extramarital relationship you get the death penalty for that encounter. Okay. Finally, the Gemara says, Hein Hein Gufei Torah. So the Gemara says, let's look at this last line of the Mishnah. It says, these are the bodies of the Torah, or the corpus, or the essential ideas of the Torah. And it seems to be only referring to the latter part of the Mishnah, which talked about the laws of dinim, the laws of karbanos, the laws of tum and tahara. But you mean what? The other things are chopped liver? I mean what? The laws of Shabbos that we said do not have strong textual support in the Torah. The laws of Chagiga, etc. Those are not called Gufei Torah. So the Gemara says, Hani in Hanach lo. So Ela Ema Hein Vehein Gufei Torah. No, what the Mishnah means to say is that regardless of whether a law has robust textual support or very minimal textual support, in both cases they are equally essential components of the Torah. That's the whole point of the Mishnah, is that don't gauge a mitzvah's importance based upon how much space it gets in the Torah. That's not the criteria. So the criterion is rather what Chazal tell you in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Both of them are equally important. Then, of course, you have to ask the question, well, why are some mitzvahs very robustly detailed and other mitzvahs very minimally detailed? That's not a question that the Gemara is prepared to undertake, and it's something that the Parshanim of Tanakh and the Baalei Machshava would engage in. Hadron Allah Hakol Chayavin. Now let's go on to the second parak of Chagiga. Just our disclaimer is that the second parak of Chagiga contains the most esoteric material in all of Shas. And what I mean by esoteric is what we would also call Kabbalistic. There is very little Kabbalistic material, at least at face value, in Shas, but in the second parak of Chagiga you will find the most of it, of that scant material, Kabbalistic material contained in Shas. I say that on the face value because on a deeper level there's Kabbalah on every page of Shas. But on face value, this is very difficult to understand because of its esoteric nature, and therefore we won't be able to hope to plumb the depths of what these things mean. Certainly not in a DAF Yomi. But we'll start it anyway. We'll do our best. Just get the Pashup shot. Ein Darshan Barayos Bishlosha. So the Mishnah tells us, because we were talking about the laws of Chagiga, that's really how we get to this, is because we mentioned in Chagiga about the scant information that's contained textually, and we talked about different kinds of biblical text, and now we're going to talk about other areas of biblical text that is clarified by Torah She'Ba'al Peh. That seems to be the connection. We're not allowed to expound on the laws of Arayos, of forbidden relationships, with three people. Below b'ma'isa b'reishis b'shnayim, we cannot expound on the laws or the story of creation with two people. Below b'merkava b'yachid, nor can we expound upon the events described in the first chapter of Ezekiel, known as Ma'isa Merkava, because it describes the vision that Yechezkel has about the God's chariot in heaven and his holy entourage. We're not allowed to even discuss that with one or in the company of one person. Unless that one person is wise and can discern things on his own. We'll explain that shortly. That if a person tries to examine the following four things, then he's rasoi, then he's worthy of, that some have the gears of ro'ilo, but Rashi's gears is rasoi, that this person is deserving of, and he says also it could mean that it would be a more compassionate act to do to that person of not creating him. In other words, put him out of his misery, because once you start examining these four things, you're going to become extremely distraught and unsettled. And what are these four things? Mala maila, mala mata, mala fanim, umala ochar. What is above, what is below, what is before, and what is after. And Rashi explains what is above and what is below refers to what is above the rakia in the celestial or the angelic entourage, and what is directly below that. And what is before and what is after. The first pshat in Rashi is a little bit difficult to understand. He says, what is to the east of the rakia, what is to the west of the rakia of the firmament. But the Tosfos Haga over here says that is difficult to reconcile in Rashi, and therefore you have to say that really what it means is chronology. What is chronologically before creation and what is chronologically after the existence of the physical world. These things are going to leave you in a very unsettled state, and you're better off never opening that Pandora's box. And finally, if a person is not concerned about the honor of his creator, it is better that he had never been created. And the Gemara will explain what that means. So the Gemara now says, let's clarify. You said that there should not be any expounding on the story of the Merkava with one individual. But then you contradict yourself, because you said unless that person is wise and discerning on his own. Now, how can a person study as an individual on his own unless he is wise? So obviously, what do you mean? You can't study it alone unless you're a smart person. Well, how else are you going to study it unless you're a smart person, unless you're wise and discerning on your own? So the statement doesn't make any sense, right? To say that you can't study it unless you're wise and discerning, then obviously the only way to study it on your own is if you're wise and discerning. So what individual is not allowed to study it on his own? So the Gemara explains...
Why couldn't somebody who is not that bright give it a tackle?
Because how are you going to possibly understand it? That's the Gemara's question. The only time a person could possibly study it properly is if he's wise and discerning. So then it's a contradictory statement. So you have to, so obviously you're not going to be able to study. That's not called studying, right? So that
has to be on Mevin Midato.
Yeah, he has to be.
He can't study it by himself unless he understands it by himself.
Right. How could you possibly do that? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. Ein dorshin be'arayos lishlosha, velo b'maisa bereshis lishnayim, velo b'merkava leyachid, ela imkein hayachacham umevin midato. So the way you understand it is that it's not studying 3, 2, and 1. It's studying 3 plus the Rebbe, 2 plus the Rebbe, and 1 plus the Rebbe. So therefore, you cannot teach the laws of Arayos if you're a Rebbe to 3 students. You cannot teach the story of Bereshis to 2 students, and you cannot teach the story of the chariot even to 1 student unless that's a wise and discerning student. And why is that? Why to a wise and discerning student and not to a guy who just needs to understand? So Rashi explains the laws of the chariot are extremely esoteric and descriptive of some really lofty concepts about God. And therefore to put them, to verbalize those very esoteric ideas is not appropriate. So if you have a student who's wise and discerning and will not question the teacher, who gives across ideas in a very encrypted fashion, and the student will be able to understand those encrypted words and understand them in his mind, then that's fine. But if the student's always constantly going to be, but Rebbe, I don't get this, I don't get that, and the Rebbe's going to be forced to articulate certain ideas that are far too esoteric to deserve to be put into real words, so then you're not. That's what's inappropriate. Certain things that are esoteric don't warrant. It's disrespectful to Hashem, in a sense, to put those ideas into verbiage.
Answer the godly gift, if you will.
Yes, there's certain things that you just cannot articulate. Ein dorshin barayos bishlosha. So the next part of the Mishnah was you're not allowed to teach 3 students the laws of Aryai. So my time, what's the reason? The Gemara in the Havamina thinks that it's based on scripture, but we're going to reject that. Maybe it's based on the pasuk. It says ish, man, to all close relative, to any relative. So ish trei sher b'saro chad. So maybe the way you read it is like this. Ish, it says the word man twice to tell you that we're talking about 2 men, and then she'er bisaro, to a relative, is talking about a 3rd person. So therefore, v'amarachmona lo sikravu lagalos erva, the Torah says do not come close to reveal erva. So therefore that could be interpreted as do not reveal the laws of erva to 3 parties, to 3 people. So the Gemara says elameata, but if that's the way you're interpreting scripture, so dichsiv ish ki yakalel lokav ish asher yitein mizaro lamola chachanami. So what about the other psukim which have the word ish written twice? It says if a man shall curse his god, if a man shall give over his seed to the molech gods, to idolatry, you're going to tell me that you have to have 2 people involved there as far as being able to learn about that law? So Ela hanohu mi boile l'rabos esanochrim shemusharin al birkas Hashem el avodah zarah ki Yisrael. The reason why it says the word ish twice is not to tell me that there's a certain limitation that only when there's 2 people involved. No, it's telling me that the word ish and ish tells me not why, whether Jew or Gentile. That's why the word ish is written twice. So, and that's true both when it comes to cursing God, that there's a Noachide prohibition of cursing God, and there's a Noachide prohibition of idolatry. So therefore, that's why Ish is written twice. Well, if that's the case, Hainomi mi boy leila rabos esanochrim shemusar al ha'arayos. So by that token, that's why the word Ish is written twice by the laws of Arayos, because the laws of Arayos apply to Jews and Gentiles alike. Ki Yisrael. So rather it's not from that pasuk, maybe it's from a different pasuk. Elam b'dichsiv u'shmartem es mishmarti. You in the plural shall guard my guardianship. So ushmartem trei mishmarti chad. Maybe the way you read it is you in the plural implies 2 people. Mishmarti, my guardianship, my in the singular implies 1 party. You add them together, 2 plus 1 is 3. That therefore you shall not do any of these abominations. And maybe therefore it's telling you that when you have a group of 3, you should not teach them about these abominations. So ela me'ata. But one second, if you're going to interpret it that way, look at other psukim that talk about ushmartem in the plural. Dichsiv ushmartem es hashabbos, ushmartem es hamatzos, ushmartem es mishmeres hakodesh hachanami. Are you going to give similar interpretations over there where it says you in the plural shall observe the Shabbos? What does that imply? That there has to be two people involved in the observance of Shabbos? Ushmartem es hamatzos, you shall guard the matzos. Ushmartem es mishmeres hakodesh, you shall guard the mishkan. So Ella Amar Ravashi, my ein dorshin b'arayos b'shlosha, ein dorshin b'sisrei arayos. So the answer is like, or bishlosha. The answer is like this. It's not based on a pasuk. When we say that you're not allowed to teach the laws of arayos to 3 students, it means that you're not allowed, or arayos lishlosh, I should say. It means that you're not allowed to teach 3 students some of the laws that are non-explicit in the Torah about arayos. And my time, and what's the reason? Svarahu. It's based on logic. That why? Because if there are non-explicit laws that are Torah Shabbal Peh about arayos, you need to make sure that the students are 100% attentive to the words of the teacher. Beitrei kiyasvi kamei Rabbi uchad shakel v'tori bahadi Rabbi v'idach matzli udne l'gemara. He says, when you have 2 students that the Rebbe is teaching, so the Rebbe will give over a law that is non-explicit. One of the students will say, but Rebbe, I don't understand. He'll start asking a question, engaging in a conversation with the Rebbe. And the other student who did not ask the question will sit silently, but listening to the conversation to get clarification. However, tlasa chad shakal v'tori bahadi Rabbi v'hanach trei shakal v'tori bahadi hadadi v'lo yadi ma'ikama Rabbayu v'asla mishrei isura ba'arayos. But if you have 3 students sitting before the Rebbe, so once the Rebbe will say something that's not explicit, one student will raise his hand, but Rebbe, I don't understand, they'll get involved in a whole discussion. The other 2 students may say to themselves, hey, and they'll start talking to each other. And while they're talking to each other, they won't hear the full clarification of the Rebbe to that student who asked the question, and they'll end up losing out some of the details that are necessary for the law, and they'll end up coming out of the shir without comprehensive information, and they'll end up becoming rabbis and paskening shilas about arayas, and will ending up permitting things that are really supposed to be usher. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi kol haTorah nami." So if that's the case, then you should never teach any Torah subject to 3 students out of concern for they won't hear it properly. So Arayos Shani Domer Mar Gezel Arayos Nafshu Mechamdasan U'Misav. The answer is that the laws of Arayos are a special case, because we learned that when both comes to laws of Arayos and it comes to laws of theft, people have a Yetzer Hara for those things. And since you have a Yetzer Hara for those things, you'll come to rationalize. And if you don't get clarity on the law, you'll rationalize that something is mutter when it's really usher. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then you should limit the amount of people that you can teach, not only by the laws of Arayos, Yachi Gezel Nami. If that's the case, then limit us to not only by Arayos, but limit the number of students when it comes to the laws of theft as well. The Gemara answers, Arayos bein b'fun of bein shelo b'fun of nafish yitzrei, Gezel b'fun of nafish yitzrei, shelo b'fun of lo nafish yitzrei. Answers the Gemara, there's a difference between the Yetzer Hara of Arayos and the Yetzer Hara of theft. The Yetzer Hara of Arayos is constant. Even when you're in the presence of your Rebbe, you're having thoughts. If you're, if especially you're a young yeshiva bacher, who knows what you're thinking in the middle of shir, right? So therefore, your Yetzer Hara is constantly on for Arayos. And therefore, we're worried that if there's 3 students, you and your friend will be schmoozing and not getting the full impact of the information. But when it comes to the laws of Gezel, you're only going to have a Yetzer Hara when you're in privacy of your own home. You don't have a Yetzer Hara for Gezel when you're in the middle of a shir with your Rebbe. And therefore, we assume that you'll be able to contain your Yetzer Hara for Gezel, and will listen, or at least get whatever information you need to get in a sufficient way that you're not going to rationalize that something is going to be permitted. I saw 2 guys talking in the corner just now. You're not allowed to expound on the story of creation to 2 students. So, where do we know this from? Because the Torah says, and this is in Sefer Devarim, it says, when you maybe you in the singular, you will ask about the early days asher hayu lefanecha that existed before you. So from there, because the Torah talks about the individual asking, Yachid Shol ve'ein shnayim sholim. So therefore we see that only one person should ask about these things, but two people should not ask or be educated about these things together. Yachol yishal adam kodem shenivra ha'olam. So you might think that if you're allowed to ask about creation, you should also allowed to be asked to ask about things that happened before creation. Talmud Omar, no. The pasuk therefore further says, "Lemin hayom asher baroi Elokim adam al haaretz," that you can only ask from the time that God created man on earth. Only then can you make the inquiry, as long as you're one person. Two people, no. But Yachol, again, because of the esoteric nature of the story of creation, Yachol lo yishal adam yisheshis yimei bereshis. But if that's the case where it says only from the time that man was created, that's only from the sixth day onwards. What about the other days of creation? What about the sixth day of creation before man was created? So Talmud Omar liyamim rishonim asher hayu lefanecha. So therefore, the next part of the first part of the pasuk says, Liyamim Rishna Mashayu Lufanecha, which is inclusive. The early days that came before you is inclusive both of the sixth day of creation and the other 5 days of creation. Yachol Yishal Adam Malamaylo Malamata Malafonim Mala Achar. So you then the Brisa says, well, you might think that it's permitted to ask about what is above, what is below, what is before, and what is after. Talmud Omar Ulamiktsei Hashamayim ve'ad Kitsei Hashamayim. The next part of the pasuk says you may ask about what is from one corner of the heaven to the other corner. So that implies that you cannot inquire about spatial infinity or chronological infinity. You have to limit yourself both spatially and chronologically to things that are within the framework or within the mental capacity of the human being. Don't go too far back or too far forward in time. Don't go too far too high in the cosmos, because that in the celestial realm, because that will be too unsettling. So the Eina Tashol Malamayla Malamata Malafinim Malachar, and therefore you cannot ask about those four things. So the Gemara now says, now wait a minute. Hash the Nafkale Milamixea Shamayim Vad Kitsea Shamayim, then Lamin Hayom Ashibar Lakimal Aretz Lamali. Well then, if the last part of the pasuk talks about from the corner of the heavens to the other, and that teaches you that you have to limit yourself both spatially and chronologically, then I already know from that part of the pasuk that I'm not allowed to ask about what happened before creation. Why then do I need the words Lemin Hayom Asher Bara Elokim Adam Ala Aretz, from the time that God created man on the world? Right? That seems therefore unnecessary. So the Gemara says, you're right. It is not necessary to teach me about what you're allowed to inquire, but it teaches me something else. Iboy le'lecha de Rebbe Lazar. The Amar Rebbe Lazar, Adam harishon min haaretz ad l'rakia. That originally, when God first created man, He created man with such a huge stature that man started on the ground with his feet, and his head extended up to the corners of the heavens. Meaning that man was extremely tall, of tall stature, when he was first created, and that's what the pasuk means. That man was originally created on the earth and extended all the way up to the heaven. So, and the cave in Shesarach, once man sinned, God placed His hands upon man and diminished him in his stature. And notice that I use the word stature, I don't use the word size, because I don't believe that the Gemara is literally speaking about man's physical size. It's talking about some spiritual stature that man had originally had, and then God diminished him. As the pasuk says, that back and forth, meaning or originally and later you created me. That implies that God originally created man in one way, and then created him another way afterwards. By what? By patoshas laikapecha, by placing your palm upon me. And this teaches me that originally man was created in a certain way, and once he partook of the forbidden fruit, God diminished his stature when He ejected him from the garden, and we are in our imperfected state to this very day. That's what the pasuk in the earlier part of the pasuk is telling you. The latter part of the pasuk is talking about the prohibition to delve into areas which are far beyond the mental capacity of the human being. So this is where we'll hold it for today. I wish you a wonderful Shabbos.